Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's webinar on managing the risk of falls in residential construction. My name is Paul Findlay, and I'm a WHS Advisor from the education team, and I'm joined by Brett Pfeffer, who is the Director of SafeWork SA's Compliant and Enforcement Directorate.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
Today's webinar is a collaboration between SafeWork SA and the Working at Heights Association. I'd like to introduce Scott Barber, CEO of Working at Heights Association, who is joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome aboard.
We can't see the presentation.
Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people as the state's First Peoples, nations, and traditional owners of South Australian land and waters. We recognize that their unique cultural heritage, customs, spiritual beliefs, and relationship with the land are of ongoing importance today, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging leaders of the future. SafeWork SA's primary function is to regulate the work health and safety laws, WHS laws, in South Australia through a combination of education and compliance activities. In 2021 and again in 2023, the construction and utilities team undertook a proactive compliance campaign on managing the risk of falls in residential construction. Today's webinar will cover the Working at Heights Association's role in assisting businesses in managing the risk of falls, background into South Australian work health and safety legislation, trends identified during the audits, and the previous 4-year injury and non-compliance data comparison. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. As I was introduced, the CEO of the Australian Working at Heights Association, and I'll give you a little background to who we are and what we're doing, and I guess our mission and vision for falls prevention in all workplaces across the country. So what we are, if you want to go to the next slide, tick along, there we go. So as an organisation, we're made up of a broad membership base, covering everybody from manufacturing of systems, PPE and the like, through to installers, recertifiers of safety systems, as well as the Rope Access Association, and anybody really involved, so be they designers, architects, safety professionals, and operational personnel. And with that, what we're trying to do is bring all those people together in a community of practice around really advancing working at height safety in the education space, advocating for best work practice, and introducing better methodologies and access to information for us to actually move forward together in shifting the stats, which have been stubbornly static for the last 5-6 years, or since we started recording them, as SafeWork Australia has started recording those statistics. Next slide. So as an association, we're trying to shift the approach, and that's through that collaboration model. So working with people like SafeWork South Australia and the other regulators and industry as well as our relationships with other industry associations like the Scaffolding Association, Elevated Work Platform Association, as well as industry groups like the formwork industry and so on. What we're trying to do is actually bring subject matter experts together and use that to actually develop better systems and a better understanding of where the gaps are and why we're still seeing the same nature of injuries and fatalities and the mechanism of injury, despite the best efforts of the regulators and our organisations. And next one. So what we're here to do really as a group is we just want to see the numbers of injuries and fatalities drop. I'll show you some statistics shortly, and that will emphasize that point. But driving that compliance and best practice, and compliance is one of those pieces which is a benchmark, but best practice is the critical area. And that's around design, selection, use of equipment, as well as training and competency. And I'll talk about competency a little bit later on in the presentation. But we want to be a forum for this kind of discussion, because even though the nature of managing falls is not necessarily complicated, because we're applying the same methodologies regardless of the areas, it's just the nuances that change. It gets complex in that each industry has its own differences that need to be managed. So if we're talking about the water industry, for example, and the nature of the environment that they're working versus mining versus high-rise construction to residential construction, even though we're using the same source material and the same methodologies, how we apply it varies. And for us as an organization to try and provide that guidance, we need to understand those nuances. Otherwise, we can't be effective. We are subject matter experts in our own right. I've been in this space for over 25 years, coming from an operational perspective, from a rescue perspective, and also from a consulting and safety perspective. So even though I can bring a lot of experience into this page, if I don't have experience in those particular industries, there's limitations in terms of what guidance I can provide, likewise with the association. So that is why the collaboration piece is so critically important, and why our collaboration with SafeWork and SA is critically important, because that way we understand what we're trying to deal with and come up with the best possible solutions. And then, of course, providing that information resource. We've worked a lot to actually provide a lot of guidance materials and so on, based on the information we're receiving from end users like yourselves, as well as from the regulators. So we can help basically translate what those requirements are into actionable outcomes, something they can actually execute on, as opposed to working with standards which are difficult to read and not necessarily designed for end users. Translating the regs and the codes, for example, into something that is actually practicable on the job site. That's what we're here to do. And with that, we've developed a number of industry codes, helping translate and distill some of the information down around platforms and walkways and anchors and so on. Because it's not necessarily all the manufacturing guides and so on that you need, is how you're going to use it and where it fits, and how that helps in terms of managing those specifics that you have on your job site. Next one. And the parallel collaboration piece, which we just talked about. So we go to the next slide. So this is the latest SafeWork stats, and what we're seeing there is that, and we're aligning falls and dropped objects because we're looking at the same environment. The nature of the injuries, it's the same kind of mechanism of injury. It's from impacts. So we're bringing the two together because if you're managing one effectively, you can manage the other effectively. But we're accounting for 18% of workplace fatalities coming from those two mechanisms of injury. That number hasn't really changed over the last, since we started recording in 2018, those specific pieces. Next one. So we're looking at 17 dropped objects and 17 fatalities from falls. This is not including the number of injuries as a result from these two mechanisms of injury. And that is something that we don't have a great deal of line of sight on, and I'm sure our friends here from SafeWork do have some better indicators in terms of what those numbers are like. But the fact that we're not seeing that massive shift, 2018 is when we started recording, and we had along the lines, I think it was 42 at that point in time. And we've managed to, sorry, it's 38. 28 falls from fatalities from falls and 15 from dropped objects in 2018. And that's dropped down to 17 and 17. So it has been a drop. But when you consider the amount of emphasis we're placing on this from an industry perspective, from a regulator perspective, obviously there's a gap there in terms of what we're doing to really see that drop down to what it should be, which is very low numbers, if nothing at all. So next one. So obviously what we're seeing and why we want this collaboration piece is that obviously we're not seeing a strong enough shift in that behavior. And we see that as a behavior piece. That's what the indicators are showing, is that there is decision making in place around either what systems or if systems should be put in place, the equipment should be used, and then how to use it. So how do we address that? As I mentioned, despite that focus from the regulator and despite the amount of information being provided by those regulators, there seems to be something missing in terms of the education and guidance frameworks there. And this is what WHA are trying to do with that, in that collaboration model, is provide some more practical guidance tools to help initiate better practices. And with the different associations and so on, what happens is we're not seeing patterns of use, and that's what we're trying to bring together. So if we understand if there's patterns in terms of the nature of the injuries and so on, then we can be more effective in addressing those directly. And then, of course, that combined voice means that we can actually do things about that as well and work with the regulators to develop better policy and work around actually best practice work methods and so on to facilitate those kind of changes if we can find those patterns. And of course, the education piece, that's an empowerment piece. And if we can actually use these different groups to expand that message and that we actually addressing some of those areas, because not knowing what you don't know is a big problem. And even thinking you know something, but not actually genuinely understanding what that issue is also problematic. So if we can actually reach a greater stakeholder base, a larger audience with better, more relevant information, then that's when we're going to see some more positive change. The next one, please. And also, obviously, as industry associations, we're trying to bring people together, and you can scroll through this one because we want to basically build a better understanding. We can build those better ideas. We can put those best practice principles in place, and we can work with training providers as well. With that kind of level of understanding of where the gaps are, we can work with them to actually develop better ways to actually educate people, because the awareness piece is critical. Understanding how to actually see the risk, look at the hazards differently, and understand why we're applying things will make a change. But we need to actually make those pools of knowledge much deeper, and we need to bring the right people into this. So the kind of engagement that we get from people like yourselves and the questions that we get many inquiries every week over a whole range of different applications and problems and issues. It informs our practice and in terms of what we do and what kind of content we're delivering. So it's really important that we continue to actually challenge ourselves in the way we do things, and that's by building a better understanding about what's happening out there in the field. The next one. This is just basically a bit of a target of what we're trying to do as an organization and why we're trying to do it, because we want to basically influence and create change. It's as an association, we're a relatively small one. We came from what was an industry association looking at standards and regs as it affected manufacturing and so on, and the installation and design of systems. I came on as CEO just over 2 years ago with the mission to basically become that outward-facing organization, and that's why we're basically building up this kind of modeling. We can go to the next one. That's fine. So, the dangers. The outcomes of falls in the workplace, like I said, they're more likely to be life-threatening, even though they account for 18% of the fatalities. When you compare it to other injury types, the potential fatality is so much greater, which is why a lot of industries and a lot of organisations, and that's including the Water Services Association, the Australian Rail Association, see it as a fatal risk factor and one of their top 10 fatal risk factors. So when we're looking at other injury mechanisms, manual handling, overexertion, and so on, there's a lot of injuries that can occur in those spaces, but they don't generally result or have a high expectation resulting in a fatality. But that's why there's such a key focus on this particular area. For the next area. So like I said, despite those advances in equipment, despite the legislation being focused on this, despite there being revisions of standards, and there's actually a new standard out for review now if anybody's interested, which is the 1891.4 has just gone out to public comment, and that's on the selection and use of equipment. So that's quite a relevant one to end users. It's probably the most relevant one out of all the body of 1891 standards. So that's actually on the Australian Standards website now, and you'll see if you're following WAHA at all or you look into it now, you'll see that there's a link to that on via our socials and on our website. But despite that, the injury piece is, from anecdotal evidence, which is what we're working with a lot of the time, is either static or increasing. And of course, that cost of business in terms of gaining compliance is ever increasing. So the investment in training and resources and so on. But we need to make sure that if we're going to invest in that space, that the training is relevant and the adoption of those systems and things that we put so much time and effort into developing, be it the equipment selection side of things, be it the training on the equipment, designing, the safe work methods for those particular tasks. There's a huge investment of time and energy into those spaces. We want to make sure that that investment is actually going to deliver a return as far as a safer and more capable workforce. So the next one. So Where we're seeing this is a bit of a training as an outlier, and I don't know if there are any people representing the training RTOs on this webinar, but there are those that are actually doing an incredibly good job, and they're designing really relevant training programs in collaboration with their customers that are addressing the risks that they face, as opposed to a really generous approach where the trainers aren't necessarily coming from a position of authority. They haven't necessarily got a lot of experience working at heights, and therefore the delivery of the content doesn't necessarily resonate with the kind of work being carried out. Because the issue that we've got with working at heights or working in falls environments is that you're not there to work at heights. The job that you're there to do at that particular point in time, not even for the entire day, it may only be for an hour or even shorter. Duration is a problem. You're having to be in a high risk environment where there is a potential for a fall. So we need to make sure that what you're doing and why you're there and the best approaches to manage that whilst you're in that space is well understood. If workers are empowered to make good decisions, and understand why they're making those decisions, then there's an efficiency piece there as well that comes into play, because we understand what the best way of actually achieving that task is in the safest and most expeditious way. So that lack of consistency that we're seeing coming out of the training organizations means that you might have contractors coming on site, and they may have come from 4 different contractors and 10 different training providers, and the level of competency coming out of those training providers can vary massively. So what you're accounting for if you're looking after safety on that site is a lack of understanding and transparency in terms of what they're coming to site with as far as a skill set and understanding. Some of which, and we know this from our own investigations into training providers and what they're delivering, some don't even actually go through the path down the path of actually practical use of equipment, even donning harnesses, adjusting and connecting into a system. So if you're working with those as well as those that have gone through more advanced training, a lot of experience in those positions and so on, how do you manage that? You're having to actually work with the lowest common denominator, which removes your ability to really focus on the job itself. So the lack of consistency and that lack of knowledge around those areas, that's where we see a gap, because compliance safety isn't necessarily addressing those needs. It's about ticking a box. We need to move away from ticking a box and really looking at how do we actually deliver a competent workforce, which is to the benefit of everybody, as well as productivity and the financial gains from productivity as well. So there might be an investment, but the fact that people are doing it safer and better means that as organizations, where financially we're going to be better off in the long term, but it's an initial investment that we need to look at, and how do we actually optimize that? Next one, please. So we've talked about this and why, and there's 5 basic particularly at heights and the construction version. They're the critical ones in this. So we don't need to spend time on this one, but as I said, we don't even know basically how we measure good and effective or correct training, because it's just the performance criteria is not outlined in the competency. It just basically, you have to hit a mark. It's not about the actual genuine competency being delivered. So we can skip to the next one, please. So why it's important and why I have these 3 logos at the top of the page is that working in that collaboration piece, we've identified a way to actually work in parallel with and complementary to the RTO delivered training, and look at that verification of competency. That VOC piece is something that these 2 primary organizations, John Holland's group and Programmed, they've identified as an area that should have significant gains if they can build that VOC model correctly. Because of the number of contractors they're working with, because of the number of internal workforce that they have, ensuring that they understand the risk and can actually execute on those broader safety systems and processes and policy and so on. If they can actually execute on that correctly, then those are generally quite robust. If we can actually make it so that it's more achievable and people understand it, then they're going to get better outcomes as a result. So identifying that there's gaps of competency and there's various levels. The fact that there are skill shortages in a lot of sectors means that we're engaging workforces that have less experience. So that is another issue for safety management and for anybody in a supervisory role, be you an employer of a contractor or be you basically in a safety leadership role. Those are challenges that we're trying to address. And that's across all areas of safety, not just heights. So again, going back to that compliance training, it's the unknown unknowns that we're trying to address. What we don't know, they don't know. What they don't know, they don't know. And what they think they know, but don't know. So there's three areas there which make it complicated. So if we don't have that line of sight of transparency, we have to assume that the training's right, but we don't have a means to actually confirm that they're going to be able to employ those safe practices. Next one, please. So the goal of this really is quite simple. We want to save lives. We want to see less of these kind of falls and incidents occurring. We want to deliver a more robust and verifiable competency and better skill sets because people make better decisions. They're more likely to go home at the end of the day. The partnerships is incredibly important because then we understand what those hazards look like, those risks look like, and what's being done now and what we can do to add to that. Reduce the risk and improve the outcomes, obviously, and improve that productivity piece, which I talked about before. So they're the kind of key goals of this whole project. Next one, please. And the idea is we take the core learning outcomes that are delivered under the RTO model. That practical element is critically important. Actually using the gear, understanding the gear, touching, feeling, donning, wearing, applying it in a practical scenario-based learning environment is so important in terms of actually connecting with the actual issue itself. If you're not ever been at height, connecting into a harness doesn't make sense. It's just a piece of kit. If you're actually trying to actually work in a restraint position on a roof structure, on some sort of structure, or climbing a ladder with a vertical lifeline, or connecting into a horizontal lifeline system, or using a temporary anchor and actually working with a twin tail lanyard, all those things inform how you can do your job as well. So understanding that is so important. So the idea behind this is that we take those core learning outcomes around, even areas of responsibility, what the hierarchy of controls actually is, and what that actually means. How do you actually look at passive and active protection? If you're having to apply active protection, what does that mean as far as equipment selection and the equipment that you may have to use because of the environment that you're working in? Then we look at things like, okay, the application of the equipment. Where do you use it? How do you use it? And why do you use it? If you're working with EWPs, what are the requirements for using PPE? If you're working with ladders, what kind of ladders can you use, should you use for different applications? Are there better means to actually gain access and work at height in that environment? Looking at what is practicable. Understanding that they're critical things because it's about, again, that decision making. And then we look at the scenario-based learning, and this is where it becomes really interesting using the model that we have, which I'll talk about in a second, is that taking what they do as a job and making it more relevant. So what they're learning is actually reflective of the tasks that they perform. So if, for example, working with the Water Services Association, we've developed scenarios which are relevant to them. With construction and facility management and maintenance, relevant to them. The Rail Association, above and below rail. And what we're using is using a platform which is developed by Area 9, which is an adaptive learning platform, which basically uses AI to actually, as a personal teacher, to guide you through. And that way, it's a personal learning journey, which basically looks at what you know and what you don't know and helps you guide through that. But also using 20 points, data points a minute, it looks at what you think you know, but you are actually wrong. And if we can address those things, and that's regardless of whether or not you've got 25 years experience in the field, or whether or not you're an apprentice coming on site for the first day, we're targeting those key areas to fill those gaps in knowledge. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what that looks like. So with this platform, this is originally based on a 45-minute e-learning piece. And it was around lockout tagout, this particular one. And the different learners had different learning journeys, and it was all the same outcomes. It's the same content, but the time it takes you to get through it, because the AI determines where you are in terms of your actual knowledge. The first learner gets through in 8.5 minutes, obviously an expert in this space, but there are a couple of areas there that they didn't know and they knew they didn't know. That was 9% of the content. 3% they thought they knew, but they didn't. And you can see the same thing through learner 2 and learner 3. So even though, you know, learner 3 still took 33 minutes and there was 29% they didn't know and 24% they didn't know they didn't know, the fact is it's still learning is basically getting to the same point. So there's 100% proficiency at the end of it. And then there's language, there's approaches, and all these things that builds consistency to our approach. So when you start talking to a cohort of workers, a big group, they all understand what you're saying because the language is consistent as well. If you go to the next slide, and this is the productivity piece, the performance, and the analytics. This was a working at heights piece that we did with John Holland Group, and they don't mind us sharing this. And what we can see from this is basically based on this group of learners, there was about a 45% initial conscious competence, but there was a 40% unconscious incompetence, which meant that they thought they knew, but they didn't. So the gap that we're worried about is that section in that bottom bar graph where the red finishes and the green finishes, and that's the gap that we're trying to address because they're the areas that there's potential risk. That's where we as safety people, we as supervisors, we as workers in the field are exposed, what we don't know. And that's what we're trying to address in this particular way. So what we're trying to do is association, and this is going back to that collaboration piece. Understand what we're missing, and then targeting that so we can actually ensure that people going to site have a better understanding of what they're looking at and then adjusting their behavior accordingly. Also empowering them to question. If they're not happy with what they're seeing, they can say to their supervisor, or they can look at the actual SWMS, or they can talk to the people that they're working with and say, I don't think this is right, let's do it differently. Not necessarily have the answers, but to question that means they're not putting themselves at risk if they're not sure. And I think that is a key area in all of this, is that being empowered to make better decisions. The next slide, please. So, looking at the outcomes. So what we're here to do is support all these campaigns, be it regulator, be it something internal with an organization, be it from an industry group, be it on a project, and actually support them as an SME. That's what we're here to do. That's why we have a board which covers all those key disciplines within working at heights, be it manufacturing, be it PPE, be it installation recertification, rope access, all these areas. We have subject matter expertise immediately available to support. Plus, we have the entire membership, which there is a huge amount of experience in that space in a whole range of areas. Building that consistency. So that consistency is not just the messaging around best practice and how we can do things better, but also around language. If we have that consistency in language when we use a term from one project to the next, it's understood. If you've got a workforce where there's a cohort that English is a second language, if we're changing the actual terminology, then they might understand the difference between this project and that project. And as contractors, we can move from site to site very quickly, 1 week here and 1 week there, or a day here and a day there. If there's a gap in understanding there, well, then basically that's another exposure that we have to try and manage. If there's consistency across industries, or even within an industry, if it's nuanced that way, then there's going to be a better understanding again. That reach, the fact that we can actually target these areas effectively is not siloed. We don't want organizations and groups to operate in a siloed way, because then you're distancing yourself from the regulators, from best practice protocol, from guidance and advice, which is going to help progress. And then we'll get the better outcomes. And ultimately, it's about that reduction. That's what we want. We want to see less injuries and less fatalities. We know we can do this. We know that we can actually hit these kind of targets, but it's the way that we work together to do that. If we try and do it by ourselves, we're not going to be able to reach that goal together, or without working together. And empowerment is a big piece for us as an organization. We want people to feel empowered to make decisions and to question. If they're confident enough to make better decisions, then we're going to see a definitive change in the outcomes. John Holland have actually put out a trial program on this, and they've seen some of their class 1 events drop down to 0, particularly in the fall space, just by addressing those gaps in knowledge, because people are looking at something now more critically. They're not there to work at heights, like I said. It's an environment they're working in that particular moment. If we can help them look at the job that they have to do with a different lens and look at it more critically and say, okay, I can't do this job connected the way that I'm connected. I'm going to be put in an awkward position to use the tooling and so on. So maybe I disconnect for just that 30 seconds while I do something. That 30 seconds of a window, gravity doesn't care at that point. So we want people to actually look at that and go, well, I can't use a lanyard in that position, but if I use an overhead SRL and retractable, then all of a sudden I can actually move around more freely and do the job more effectively, and I don't have to disconnect. So those kind of decision makings make life a lot easier for all of us, and at the end of the day, hopefully pushes me out of a job and makes life easier for our friends that we can see on the other screen as well from SafeWork, and that they're not having to actually go to site and look into these things. So there's a lot of information available. We have a lot of information on the website, which we, like I said, is developed in collaboration with SMEs across a whole range of different sectors and specialists in different groups. That's freely available to everybody. And if you have specific questions, we're also available to help. So I just want to say thank you very much to SafeWork for the opportunity to talk to you today. We have some ambitious projects, and we're about to roll out this project. We're in proof of concept at the moment with this learning project, which again is available to everybody. If you've got questions about that, my contact details will pop up on the next screen as well. And I'm very much available to answer any of your questions. And if I don't, even though I've got experience in this space, if I don't have an answer, we have the answers within the organization. And I'm more than happy to put you in contact with somebody that can guide you through any issues that you may have. So thank you so much for your time. And I'll open the floor to any questions.
Sorry, a minute.
And the fact that everybody's quiet means that it's all resonated beautifully and we're all
Okay. You're on.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. Doesn't look like any questions are forthcoming at this time. You're welcome to write to us and we'll take those on board and forward them to Scott if you think of something. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you very much for and the Working at Height Association for the continued support and their commitment in supporting business and regulators in reducing the unnecessary injuries associated with working at height. With the building and construction industry being one of the most important industries in South Australia, it is also one of the most high risk, which is why improving health and safety in this industry is a national priority under the new Australian Work Health and Safety Strategy. A fall from height injury can have a devastating impact physically, emotionally, financially to workers, their families, and the wider community. So throughout May, SafeWork SA has been publishing injury and compliance information to help inform duty holders about the industries, workers, and activities most at risk from a fall from height. I'll now hand over to Brett to provide an introduction and background into the residential construction sector. Did you have something to say, Scott? You look like you're... Oh,
We can't hear you, Scott.
yeah, is your mic off?
I turned my mic off then. The comment
Yes.
then was that they were muted, so they couldn't ask questions. But maybe if there's something in the chat you want to throw in there,
That's right.
and then we can come back to it, even at the end of the next chat.
No worries, thank you.
Yeah, we're all muted, so you got to speak. All right. Okay, thanks, Paul. So in the construction industry, there's a broad acceptance that there's limitations around the accuracy of Return to Work SA injury data. So within the residential construction sector, there is extensive use of self-employed contractors. So these self-employed contractors not registered with, nor do they report injuries to Return to Work SA. So this causes significant underreporting of injuries in the sector. So furthermore, injury claims data associated with residential construction excludes associated trades such as bricklaying, carpentry, roofers, plumbing, electrical plasterers, etc. And this type of work comes under the Return to Work SA sub-industry of commercial construction. So the injury data associated with residential construction, in my opinion, is an underestimate of the true picture of the safety performance of the sector. So it's clear from the claims data that the housing industry's poor safety performance is hidden through contractor engagement and management and limitations around injury data reporting, which I mentioned earlier. So with those limitations on injury data on falls from one level to another, over the previous 4 years, SafeWork SA has interrogated its own data to try and get a true picture of what's happening in the residential construction sector. Let's just go through those now. So the previous 4 years, across all industries in 2022, we saw a 25% reduction in serious injuries associated with floor, but then we saw that increase again in 23 by 36%. So as you see, the graph on the screen clearly shows there's no improvement in the residential construction sector, with an average of 36 serious injuries a year and an incredible 292 non-compliance identified by inspectors in 2023. That was during our campaign. So as you can see with that data, based on that data, the residential sector are at most risk of a fall from high compared to other industries. So we're lucky enough to get some return to work data for you. So that shows the previous 6 years, and you can see that through construction, not just residential, it's slowly and continuing creeping up, no matter what efforts we put in place to minimise that. So before we look at the 2023 campaign findings and trends, I'll just give you some background on our South Australian legislation. So the model WHS laws commenced in Australia in 2012, but was delayed in South Australia by a year, so we didn't get it to 2013. So when the laws were introduced, the regulations associated with high risk construction work activities that involves a risk of a person falling more than 2 metres was changed to 3 metres. So this change was made by the residential sector in the misguided belief that no controls were required to minimise the risk of a fall to 3 metres. And as most of us know, most fall injuries are below 3 metres. Further to this, in 2014, the housing industry lobbied and got the Construction Work and Preventing Falls in Housing Construction Code of Practice disallowed, stating the codes were too prescriptive. Again, the sector did not understand that the absence of the codes did not eliminate the obligation to comply with the laws. It only removed the housing industry's guidance on how to comply with the law. Then lastly, just to keep adding to it, in 2015, the housing industry lobbied for an increase in the monetary threshold of a construction project from 250,000 to 450,000 to ensure housing projects were not subjected to additional safety requirements as a principal contractor. Again, this is a misguided belief that by raising the threshold, the obligations and responsibilities of the builder would be diminished. So we look at the 4-year comparison data. It shows that serious injury reported SafeWork has increased in the construction industry. So we are seeing a pretty level, but we're starting to see it come back up again. These are non-compliances identified by inspectors. So you'll see 23. I know there was a campaign there, but 356. I think all up, inspectors identified around 400 non-compliances and 356 are just residential. And I always say for every prohibition, every improvement has either saved a life or actually saved a serious injury. So that's pretty high stats there. So while we saw a continued decrease number of serious injuries below 3 metres between 2020 and 2022 and 23, we saw an increase back to 83%. So I chose 3 metres because that's the threshold for SWMS. So you can see a lot of serious injuries are below 3 metres. So in regard to managing high-risk construction work requires a SafeWork method statement. SafeWork has developed a lot of guidance material, including a recently published completed SWMS template. And SafeWork Australia has also developed interactive SWMS guidance tool, which contains step-by-step information, videos, and examples. So I think Paul will talk about that a bit later. Although we saw quite a good improvement in 2021, primarily due because we did a SWMS campaign, a lot of information on the website. So we've seen that steady around 34% of failure to comply with high-risk construction work. This is ladders, so it's a big cause of injuries. So this graph shows the percentage of injuries below 2 metres from ladders. Although last year was probably our best year, although it's still quite high. From 2023 data, again, the main contractor who's most at risk is Carpenter. They don't seem to understand how to manage risk of falls. They think they're acrobats. And you can see 137 non-compliance, 13 serious injuries, and 30% of those were to apprentices. And as an activity, working on a roof continues to be a high-risk activity, but here's some data from our 2023 snapshot. So as you can see, carpenters and steel frame stores had the most serious injuries and non-compliances, though we have seen a significant risk of working in unprotected voids, particularly stair voids. What we got there? Yeah, very high. Yeah.
In 2021 and 2023, SafeWork SA undertook a managing risk of falls in residential construction campaign. The objectives of the campaign were to measure compliance against the managing risk of fall regulations and to ensure that persons with management control of the workplace, for example, a builder engaging a contractor, met their shared WHS obligations and responsibilities. Let's start by looking at what the work health and safety regulations requires you to do to manage the risk of a fall.
Yeah, unfortunately, I put up the wrong presentation, so the link's not embedded. So on our website, we've got videos on managing risk of falls and the hierarchy of controls, which I recommend you would go and see, but we are starting to run out of time, so we might have to move on, Paul.
Okay.
I'll just give some background on the campaign. So between 3rd of July and last year to the 29th of December, SafeWork inspectors attended 90 work sites and completed 142 audits across multiple duty holders. So they consisted of 90 contractors, 58 person management control, such as builders or a PCBU engaged contractor, and 47 of those sites met the definition of a construction project. You can see by that graph, so 156 elevated workplaces were identified. Oh, we just have to move a bit faster, Paul. Sorry. So that campaign identified 266 breaches, resulting in 188 prohibitions and 78 improvement notices. I don't know if that's quite right. Yep. So again, it's very unusual for a proactive compliance to have more prohibition notices, although these results were similar to the 2021 campaign. So the results again make it clear that the residential section is not doing enough to protect its contractors and workers. So with the Managing Risk of Falls campaign, 180 activities that required, sorry, where am I at? All right, the Managing Risk of Falls campaign, so 180 activities were prohibited, requiring immediate stop of the activity because of immediate risk, and 35 required improvements. So 22 improvement notices were associated with failure to comply with SWMS or prepare SWMS, and 21 improvement notices were given to principal contractors for failing their duties. So principal contractor failing their duties, that they must have processes in place for ensuring compliance with falls or ensuring that the SWMS is compliant. So there was other things identified during this campaign. So to support the Nowhere to Go campaign with electrical trade unions, Nowhere to Go campaign, we also looked at toilet facilities. So out of those 90 audits, 79 failed to meet compliance. And additionally, a further 188 statutory notices issued for other non-campaign related breaches, consisting of 24 prohibitions and 64 improvements. So just look at those. So toilet facilities, 79, site security, 48, housekeeping, 47, site signage, 36. Site signage is for a construction project, and electrical issues comes at 5th. There's another video which I'd recommend going to on our website. It's it aligns the hierarchy of control with the hierarchy of controls for managing risk of falls. I think it's a very good video, and I recommend you to go see them. Right.
Thanks, Brett. So far, we've looked at the overall data from the 90 site visits, and so what does the law require you to do to eliminate or minimize the risk? I'm not putting that video over.
No, let's move on. I'll go on. So we've just got a photo gallery here. So obviously, to minimise risk of fall, work must be planned through safety design to eliminate risk where practical. So work sequencing is another way to eliminate risk where practical by doing some of the work on the ground and following construction. Had we have watched the videos, you would have seen that portable ladders are the lowest form of control, so they're even lower than a harness. Yet we continue to see portable ladders as a go-to equipment for working at heights in the residential sector. So these are some photos taken through the campaigns. We'll just quickly go through. So there you go. There's a stair void, unprotected, access ladder, not secured or set up correctly. Let's get it quick. There's a carpenter standing on a top plate, no protection. You might not be able to see it, but that person standing on the top plate, right below him is an A-frame ladder right on the edge. And a bit more to the left, there's an access ladder not secured or set up correctly. So that's it does look a bit commercial, but it was a residential. That's quite a high way up. It's probably about 7 meters. Absolutely nothing in place. And that person actually ends up going right to the edge of the building. There's carpenters again. Inappropriate use of the ladder. So you'll see that this person set their extension ladder up on the back of the ute and climbed up. So, you know, I would assume that that building originally had a scaffold around it. Probably poor planning, removed the scaffold because cost, and then has had to come back to do something. So when you look at that, probably a EWP would have been a better option. Again, there's some glaziers there. You can see the access that's not set up properly. They're right on the edge. I know the roof line hides it there, but they're working right to the edge. Yeah, this one, it's quite terrible. So you can see they're actually working off A-frame ladders on the second level there, unprotected edge on an unstable ladder. I couldn't think of a worse work positioning design at all. So just through so because we saw a lot of scaffolds through the campaign. So obviously scaffolds against the working face can't be greater than 225 millimeters, otherwise it becomes a full risk. It's got a large drop from one level to another, so vertically it should be 300 mil. So it's hard on the left side here. You can see the platform, but there's actually a large drop down to the next level. Here you can see a big gap, unguarded, and it just throwing some planks across. So you're walking the plank to get across the other side. Here, you can see the access ladders of the scaffold, and it's got a handrail going across. So that's actually getting in the way of a person accessing or egressing can create a full risk. So this is access on the working deck. So that should be a gate. Here's a access ladder for internal void. Just try and get that a bit more height. And that's the other end. They couldn't get enough height, didn't extend a 900 meter past. Here's the inappropriate use of the ladder. So you can see second level, it's just trying to sit on some planks there. So quite dangerous. Again. Carpenter again, walking on top plate. This is scaffold set up without safe access to working decks. This person's had to go on a balcony and try and step across. Quite terrible planning. This is a plasterer using an A-frame ladder on top of the scaffold and has fallen to the ground. It's an A-frame on a platform. Solar panel. Just poor ladder setup and no edge protection. Yeah, no forge protection ladder set up incorrectly. Poor ladder setup. Worker climbing up, actually holding material, so you can't maintain 3 points of contact. Standing close to the edge. Another one in your previous ladder, so a ladder off the back of a ute to get that additional height. You can see here, no edge protection. Standing on top plate, portable ladder, so one of the worst things you can do. Very unstable, very dangerous. Stair access, so stair access, no handrails either side. One on the right, which is a good effort, but you're missing the handrails again, so you're creating a full risk, even though you're trying to control a risk. Solar installs without full protection, so it's reasonably practical to put handrail across the working face. Incomplete scaffolds, you can see there, you can walk off the edge. More incomplete scaffolds. just timber made up to extend to try and close a gap was inappropriate because, like I said, sometimes people do these things and they could give other people a false sense that it's safe. So if someone stepped in that, they would have fallen, potentially injured themselves or killed themselves. His again, placed on top of the portable ladders to gain additional height. So that puts your feet above the handrails. So that's quite dangerous. All right, so just continue. So we'll just call that contract management. So subcontract is a major feature in the residential construction sector, and the contracting out of WHS duties by builders can have negative health and safety effects on contractors' workers. Subcontractor can encourage a culture where the objective is to get the job finished as quick as possible with minimum attention to safety. So the managing contractors are a key component of the campaign. So what you need to understand is under the revoked OHS law, so pre-2012, there needed to be a direct link between the employer and the employee. And that left a lot of duty holders not being held accountable for their acts or omissions. So they had a lot of influence. And then there was just no law to prosecute them for their failures. So the introduction of WHS legislation, the definition of work is quite broad now. So that now includes employees, labour hire contractors and subcontractors, volunteers. So I'll just ask Paul to explain that requirement.
Thanks, Brett. Based on those photos, there's a lot of room for improvement.
I agree.
As a builder or business, you owe a duty of care when you direct or influence work carried out by a worker, engage or cause to engage a worker to carry out work, including through subcontracting, or have management or control of a workplace. Primary duty of care applies to all businesses regardless of the terms of any contract. The no contracting out provision is fundamental to the Act. This provision essentially means that you cannot limit or modify your obligation by way of a contract with a contractor. Each business retains responsibility and must discharge their duty to the extent that they have the capacity to influence or control the matter, disregarding any attempts to contract out their responsibilities. So businesses are required to consult, cooperate, and coordinate activities so that WHS risks can be effectively managed. The purpose of consultation is to ensure everybody has a shared understanding of the risk, who will be affected, and how the risk will be controlled. This exchange of information helps each person to meet their duty and minimize gaps in WHS management. This process can range from directly discussing and planning daily work with contractors, for example, restarts, to establishing formal mechanisms with written agreements and consultation meetings such as toolbox meetings.
Hey, thanks, Paul. So effective contract management is one key principle of the legislation. So obviously during the campaign, 58 work sites are under management control of a business, so typically a builder. So there appears to be a disparity between the arrangements being made by the builder and the significant risk the contractor faces and working at height of their workplace. So the campaign results identify the builders need to work more closely with contractors working at height and monitor contract performance against the arrangements made. So during the campaign, a number of audits identified workers working above 3 meters, which requires a SWMS for high-risk construction work. So Paul will just give a quick overview of the regulatory requirements for a SWMS.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. There's 18 activities that are classified as high-risk construction work in the legislation due to their significant potential for serious harm that is often associated with those activities. A high-risk construction work SafeWork method statement is a document prepared in consultation with all the relevant persons, including workers, that accounts for the workplace-specific circumstances that may affect the way in which the high-risk construction work is done. So a SWMS needs to identify the hazards and risks associated with the high-risk construction work, describe to workers in clear terms how following control measures will manage those risks, and as a minimum, the SWMS must identify the work that is high-risk construction work, state the hazards and risks to health and safety from that work, clearly detail the measures selected to control those risks, and describe how the risk control measures will be implemented. The SWMS also needs to take into account the circumstances at the workplace that may affect the way in which the work is carried out. If the work is carried out, for example, in connection with a construction project, will be a WHS management plan in place at the workplace. And it should be set out and expressed in a way that is readily accessible and understandable to the workers who use it. Duty holders, builders, and subcontractors must ensure that once a SWM has been developed and implemented, the high-risk construction work to which it relates is performed in accordance with the SWM. If a duty holder becomes aware that there is non-compliance with the SWM, they must stop work immediately or as soon as it's safe to do so, and not allowed to resume until the SWM is complied after being reviewed and revised as necessary. This clearly shows that a SWM must be site-specific, as a SWM is a non-negotiable document. SafeWork SA has information available on their website, or if you require assistance, please contact us.
Thanks, Paul. So SafeWork's been working in the industry since 2017 on high-risk construction work, so both me and Paul, so been here a while. And we've seen some good improvements in commercial civil construction sectors, so it'd be good to see improvements in the residential sector. So on a construction project involves construction work valued at 450,000 or more, that's South Australia. There's a requirement to have a principal contractor with manual control of the workplace. So the only thing we're going to point out about that principal contract construction project is that principal contractor must take all requisite steps to obtain a copy of the SWMS relating to high-risk construction work before it commences, and must also have in place arrangements for collecting, assessing, and monitoring and viewing the SWMS. So that's one thing. Another thing. But they also have further duties relating to specific regulations, such as managing risk of falls. There's a number of things like managing falling objects, first aid, but there's a specific duties. So that under those, the principal contractor must put in place arrangements. So it's not good enough to have an arrangement in place with your contractor, yes, that they will do something. Yes, you've got to do that, but you also must ensure that those arrangements are in place. So there's just that extra step more, and that could be photo, certificates, CSC, something to demonstrate to the principal contractor that those controls are actually in place. But we did see through the campaign that the SWMS are not getting checked enough. It's just been treated like paper, and everyone knows that paper doesn't save anyone. So where did I go? So we go too far. Just want to talk about scaffolds. I get through. So obviously scaffolds are erected to assist in assessing areas of height and to aid safety on a work site. So incorrect installation, unauthorised alterations and use can make a work site more hazardous. So unauthorised altering of scaffolds by untrained, unlicensed contractor is common in residential construction, can lead to poor safety outcomes for persons who need to use that scaffold. I won't fly through this now. So the failure to maintain a scaffold was a major issue identified during the campaign. So during the whole of 2023, so I thought I'd get the whole year's data, there was 373 statutory notices issued against scaffolding. So there was 165 prohibition notices and 208 improvement notices. So while it's good to see a high number of scaffolds being used, the one-size-fits-all approach does not work due to different type of work activities carried on scaffold. The scaffold needs to be continually altered to suit each and every situation, with alterations only being done by a common person. So most non-compliance identified on a scaffold during the campaign was caused by unauthorised alteration to the scaffold. Try and fly through. Sorry. These are just all things. So just quickly talk about portable ladders for.
Portable ladders are one of the least stable but most commonly used tools. I think we saw that earlier for working at heights. Incorrect selection, setup, and use of ladders can result in a fall. And as we saw earlier in the hierarchy, ladders are at the very bottom of the hierarchy and are lower than harness use.
Just so I throw a photo there. So a while ago, we received a notification of a serious injury. So on that image there, the worker was working off the A-frame and fell, but his actual foot landed on the Rio bar, and right almost in the centre of the photo, you can see where the boot's stuck in the Rio bar. So that's an actual photo taken by a co-worker on site. So had the worker landed differently, it could have been killed. So just try and finish off. So I think to improve worker safety in the residential construction sector, the residential sector needs to focus on management scaffold, ensure they're fit for purpose to maintain a safe condition. Contractor management, so have a conversation with your contractors or builders. Builders need to see whether they have systems in place to manage risk of falls. Builders checking that contractors are following established arrangements. Portable ladders, so like Paul said, there can be sensible and practical options for working at height when the use of other equipment is not reasonably practical, but they shouldn't be used for low risk and short duration work. So ladders usually the only option to work at height needs to stop. So the law requires workers to work from a solid construction, so ladders just unstable. Swims are high risk construction work, so contractors must have site-specific swims that are being followed. So again, should be on our website today or very soon. We've actually got a completed swims on place for first fix carpentry on a double-story house near a power line, so help people understand how to map it out. And principal contractors must have arrangements in place for ensuring compliance with the falls management, so they must.
So SafeWork SA has got a lot of guidance material available on our website, as you can see. We've got information on contractor management, principal contractors, high-risk construction work swims, elevating work platforms, fragile roofing, scaffolding, scaffold access and egress, edge protection, solar panel installation, installing prefabricated roof trusses, and installing roof battens. So I'd recommend to all of today's participants to subscribe to our newsletter, where you can keep up to date with SafeWork SA's expectations. And you can contact us on a 1300 number where we have a good helpline, and you can book a WHS Advisor like myself to come out for free and have a look and give some advice on policies, procedures, practices, and what's happening in your workplace.
I'll just try and finish off. So we've got only a couple of questions here. So are these falls caused by workers not wearing harnesses, or what is the main cause? So actually through the campaign, we hardly come across harnesses. I recall 21 we came across 5, but this year's a couple. So what we see in residentials, they're not actually even going to falls. It's ladder or nothing. It's ladder, scaffold, non-compliant scaffold. What else we got here? So solar panel installers are often viewed wearing a harness and a lanyard attached to their own shoulder. Is there a plan to target this industry? Yeah, so that campaign covered solar panel installers. I know nationally we're looking at writing guidelines for solar panel installers, but again, if I think about complaints, look at our data, we see that we don't see harness use that much. It's either they've got edge protection or they're just taking a risk working at height. So harnesses are actually becoming a rare thing to see in South Australia. What else we got here?
And just if I can just add to that, we're actually working with the Solar Energy Installers Association. They've identified that obviously there's gaps in terms of how they're doing it. So they're looking at better methods. So we're working with them to develop some procedures and so on. Obviously using things like scaffolding and work platforms and things like that, and edge protection, which is ideal, but also what they can do as far as PPE selection and what they're connecting to, and temporary anchor solutions and things like that. So they, as an industry, are moving towards better practices, but that's still pretty loose in terms of what we're seeing from our side as well.
Excellent. Well, I think that's it. Thanks very much, Scott. There you go.
Yes, thanks everyone for attending today. Working at heights can be done safely if contractors, workers plan the job well, have good supervision in place, use the right safety equipment, and do not take risks. Risk of injury or death from a fall can be prevented through use of properly built scaffolds, edge protection, void covers, work platforms rather than ladders, and fall arrest systems that are attached to an appropriate anchor point with a correctly adjusted lanyard.
All right, this concludes today's webinar, and I thank those that attended today, and I hope you found information useful. So please remember the SafeWork SA advisory service if you require assistance. So Scott, do you have any closing message before we go?
No, like I said, reach out to people like yourselves, and likewise, you can reach out to me if you've got any questions. I can put you in contact if it's outside of my area of expertise, and put you in contact with somebody that can help you. So we're all here working together to get the better outcomes. So let's go on the journey as a partnership.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for attending. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.